Countdown from 6. It's always weird like that. Okay, so welcome, Nathan. We've just, we've done an introduction which you heard and have completely approved of. So our listeners know who you are, but thank you for joining us.
That's right. Yeah, it's my pleasure. Stoked to talk, guys.
Yeah, and Matt, you're here too, just
I'm
in
here.
case.
It's
Yeah.
good to be with you again. I'm joining you from Australia Day. It's Australia Day in Australia. Sorry, not Australia Day, Anzac Day. That stands for Australia and New Zealand Army Corps. This is the day we celebrate all the wonderful things the military did. But I'm taking a
That's
break from that, from the various rituals and ceremonies, and taking time to be with you both.
That's
Happy
good.
day.
And we've brought Nathan here just to talk about that topic specifically. Australia and New Zealand. It's a military day. He's
I'm writing a
focused on
thesis
that
on it.
topic. Yeah. No. Nathan is here in part because he previously, I think, recently stopped, but was running a brand Twitter account that had achieved some level of fame and notoriety. The Steakums account, which produced a, a bunch of quite detailed threads that I think it's fair to say would put some researchers to shame on conspiracy theories and uh, good heuristics for identifying reliable information and so on. So we wanted to bring Nathan on to talk about that account and how he ended up doing that, and is interested in those topics more generally, and also broadly the weird Twitter ecosystem, which Nathan has a much better grasp of, and a lot of brand accounts seem to play in the water of. Though I suspect Nathan will have some thoughts about where those connections go. But yeah, so I maybe a good place to start for anybody who isn't familiar is how would you describe what the Steakums account did, and like why it became a kind of popular meme. So what's the kind of nutshell description of that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, most people, if they have any familiarity with brands on Twitter or brands online, they tend to think of Wendy's Twitter, which got famous in early 2017 for roasting people and just kind of developing the sort of sassy brand personality. And brands have been doing that since, like, the early 2010s, on and off, and some in more obscure ways that didn't necessarily get a lot of press coverage. I would say Denny's had a Tumblr account in like 2013 that was pretty popular. That they then kind of moved to Twitter. There was a couple smaller ones like Hamburger Helper. It's mostly food, like
Yeah,
CPG
there's a
or
theme.
restaurant. Yeah, yeah, mostly CPG or restaurant brands. Just like traditionally, like with weird commercials and mascots. Like there's something about that part of the industry. So Wendy's was like the first one that like nationally put that on the map. I mean, it was covered on Anderson Cooper. It was this whole huge thing where people were like, "What the hell is going on with this fast food account?" So I actually had started working on the Steakum account, which, for those who don't know, it's like this cheap, like frozen slab of meat product that's sold in America, and you make like what we call Philly cheesesteaks. I'm from right outside Philadelphia. It's just basically like a hoagie with meat and cheese. So yeah, hoagie like a sandwich.
Yeah,
I don't know
thank you.
how
Yeah,
colloquial a hoagie even is, but
that was
so
helpful.
yeah, I'm just putting it out there for anybody. So yeah, I started working. I worked for an advertising agency, and we started doing work on this account in like 2016, and then by 2017, after this whole thing with Wendy's had already kind of taken off, I had proposed to the client, for us to do this on Twitter as well, and it was basically a blank canvas. So like the account didn't really have a following, comparatively to Wendy's, which is a pretty large national fast food chain. Steakin' was mostly regionally based, so it didn't have like it had some name appeal. Like it was kind of a meme over the decades, like kind of funny food brand. So some people knew what it was, but it wasn't huge. So it didn't really have like this built-in following that we had to kind of build from scratch. So 2017, I started messing around with it. The client just didn't really take it too seriously because they were like, "Oh, this is who cares? Like, who's on Twitter even? Like, Twitter is not as popular as Facebook or these other platforms like YouTube." So it was kind of just an oversight, and I just spent a lot of time in these weird Twitter, what is referred to as weird Twitter, which is this kind of niche subculture that really was one of the first subcultures that kind of grew into a lot of what we see now as like the ironic kind of humor that makes up a lot of how people post on Twitter, which is just kind of sarcastic, and I call it irony poisoned. Like everything is kind of just bizarrely framed and kind of meant to be nonsensical, sort of dadaist in a way. So I started playing around in some of these circles. The sort of weird backstory to why is because when I started working on the account, I had noticed that whoever was running it before me, when it only had like 1,000 followers, it was pretty inactive. But whoever was running it before me had blocked like 200 or 300 accounts, and I'm like, who are all these people? And I started going through, and I'm realizing they're all weird Twitter people. So I'm like, oh, there's got to be some history here. Like something must have happened. Sure enough, there was this whole thing where I guess the previous social media manager who was running this account had been kind of like had a weird run-in with some of these weird Twitter accounts where they would harass the brand, and then the brand blocked one of the larger ones. His handle was Boner Hitler. So this guy, he had a big enough following, like 10,000 plus followers, where when he realized he was blocked by Staka, made a whole like stink about it, and then got all these other people from weird Twitter to harass this brand. So the brand just went on this blocking spree. So when I got a hold of the account, I unblocked all these people and I started engaging them in a kind of like tongue-in-cheek, self-aware way, where it was kind of like, I shouldn't have blocked you all, like kind of almost like humanizing the brand in a way where it felt much more, just personable and less like corporate, like, oh God, like how do I interact with these weird people? So that really was what initially kind of planted the seeds for the account to get traction, and then over time, as I just got more comfortable, like figuring out what the voice would be, it evolved into like cultural commentary, I guess, like you alluded to, Chris, which is just like talking about like the problems in society and like media literacy and all these things that ended up kind of becoming these viral moments that snowballed between like 2017 and then 2021 which I just stopped running it a few months ago. So very very strange kind of corner of the internet, but in a weird roundabout way, weird Twitter kind of birthed the brand and like also inspired a lot of the weird brand stuff that you see in general on the platform.
Yeah, so there's a few other corporate accounts that have taken like a similar kind of line in terms of being, lighthearted or satirical or ironic or whatever, to varying degrees. But probably your handling of the Staycomes account was unique, I think, in um, doing quite, I guess, substantive threads on topics like folk epistemics and science literacy and conspiracy theories. So I think that's something that really made what you did stand out.
Yeah, I think so. The first time I experimented with that, it was kind of on accident because in interacting with these weird Twitter groups, which evolved, as you guys know, when you're on Twitter, there's a million subcultures. So like over time of being on the platform, you kind of like naturally filter in to different groups or echo chambers, whatever you want to call them. Like there's library Twitter where it's just full of librarians. You got like parts of like the medical community. You've got anime fans. You've got what they call stands of various pop culture figures or singers or whatever. So we would kind of like stumble along, right? Like you'd see a viral tweet, interact with it. Suddenly, all the people in that bubble would start to interact with the brand then, and you'd get this cross pollination of groups. So along the way, I was just kind of tweeting and figuring out like what is sticking with people, and those threads early on, before they ever even went viral, I was realizing they were sticking with the audience a bit. So the end of 2018, I did this one that was this kind of like just commentary on like why young people, particularly online, are just acting strange. In one way I put was that they were flocking to brands because we were actually getting through the commentary we were doing. We had been getting these like extremely vulnerable DMs from random people, mostly kids, like teenagers, college students, that would be like spilling their guts, talking about their home life, their relationships, their mental health problems. I'd be getting these messages through the brand account, like, what is going on? Like why? If I was a person struggling, like, why would I reach out to this frozen meat brand? So this thread I originally did in 2018 was just kind of like a commentary on that. It was like, okay, just as much of the analysis that you guys have done, that others have noted the past few years, the sort of growing societal distrust and rising inequality and kind of the doomerism we see in culture, all these kind of compounding variables as I saw them, kind of pertaining to why some random kid would reach out to a brand like this. And that took off then. And then everybody was like, why is this frozen meat brand doing commentary like this? Like, this doesn't make any sense. And then to my knowledge, I think I was the first, or Steakum was the first brand to have like viral success through those long form threads, because it is a very unconventional way. Now you see threads a lot more like with public figures, but especially a few years ago, like they just weren't as common of like a popular form. Like people like the sharp, witty, short tweets. So to see like that serious kind of commentary juxtaposed with this frozen meat brand, I think that those two things combined really are what made it pop off.
And I'm just curious as well, Nathan, when you decide to do that, like if you want to make a thread like that, do you have to get it signed off in advance, or is there like, you have the freedom to experiment? Like what leeway? Because I imagine like if you were a brand account and the brand guy started promoting QAnon conspiracies instead, you'd probably get a lot of engagement as well, but the brand might not like it. So it seems online misinformation or that kind of thing, it also attracts attention, right? There's people that would not agree with
Right.
like the kind of things that you were talking about. So I'm just wondering, in that respect, like how much freedom you have, and do you get much of the flip side of people kind of saying Steakums is part of the Illuminati
Oh
kind of
yeah,
thing?
always. Yeah, always. Like, well, especially in like the rise of like as we've all seen the woke brand trend, especially in the aftermath of like the BLM protests of 2020, where there's this kind of like uh coalition of brands that kind of all came together in a very short period of time suddenly, like never having this as part of their messaging in the past, all of a sudden being like, we're pro Black Lives Matter, racial equality, like they overnight changed a lot of I don't want to say like fundamental pillars, but like clearly their outward, their PR and their messaging shifted with the culture. So I think in a similar way, we and I were lucky that the things that I were saying, they fit roughly within the status quo. I mean, like, to answer your question directly, this account is very unique in that I did have a lot of freedom, and I from the very beginning this whole thing was very like a happy accident. Like no one, including the client, no one expected the brand to go viral, to have the level of success that it did. So there was no like guardrail system in place beforehand. So then once it started going viral, it was kind of like, okay, it's already the ship's already taken off. Like now we just have to kind of control it as we go.
Mm.
And the client, I mean, for all the, it was like a 4 or 5, or no, it was 5 year client relationship we had with them, and there's a lot of trust built into that relationship that allowed me as like a writer to be in person, putting together these thoughts to make sure, because you guys know this, like when you're tweeting things from any perspective, like unless there's certain shit posters who they don't give a shit about how their content's received. But if you're trying to put ideas out there, unless you're the kind of person who just can like post and then log off and not worry at all about the backlash, which is like nobody, like 1% of the population, you're gonna you have to like consider all of like the caveats and the nuances and like thinking like 4D chess. Like, how do I get 4 steps ahead of what like backlash I might get from this group or that group? So there was a lot of thought that had to go into these threads, and if I had a corporate bureaucracy trying to like edit and refine that along the way, I don't think it ever would have worked. So it was kind of anomalous in that way.
Yeah, but it must have taken a really high degree of trust from this corporation to, yeah, allow you to just, give you your head basically, and do what you thought was responsible and was not going to embarrass them, and would still be interesting and informative and funny and all of that stuff. I'm just kind of amazed that it happened, to be honest. How did
I
it
mean,
happen?
yeah, same. And it was a weird ride too, because like there were obvious like you have to imagine, especially the early times when it would happen, it would happen so quick in the zeitgeist. So like the tweets would go viral usually overnight. So like I would tweet them in the afternoon, they'd pick up steam and eventually, start taking off in the evening. And then the next morning, we would be getting all these calls from like we would got calls from the one we did with Neil deGrasse Tyson that went viral. We were kind of beefing with him, where he made some comment. It was like a kind of standalone quote. He said, "Science is the great thing about science is that it's true whether or not you believe it." And we said, "Log off, bro," in a like pretty snarky way. And then we followed it up with this kind of like epistemic, takedown of like why that isn't necessarily great messaging from our point of view. Which
Yep.
is again ridiculous coming from this brand. But we literally that next morning we got a call from Fox News on behalf of Tucker Carlson to come on and talk about this whole. I'm sure it was like a slow news day in the culture wars for him to reach that low, but it was we've gotten a lot of those types of calls from news organizations from all across the political spectrum. Just because it's goofy. It's kind of like it's perceived as like I think a fun escape from the more serious things going on. So it's and of course the client relationship regarding that was very tumultuous because they're like, what
Yeah.
the hell do we do? Like, how do we reply? We had to turn down most of them because we just couldn't react quick enough in terms of what would be brand safe or whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it is a bizarre situation to be in, and I guess related to that is I've seen, I'm sure you've seen as well, Nathan, that there, although like I would say people like Matt and myself were very appreciative because the threads were just good. They were like good information, but I seen some reaction from a couple of disinformation researchers, and particularly people that lean more lefty, right? That they kind of were like, this is a corporate account, like it's giving information, but never forget that it just wants to sell you processed meat, right? And
Totally.
then
Yeah.
yeah, but then I also saw that you did a thread at some point, which basically made that point directly saying, don't trust us or any other corporate account. We are here to market and sell processed meat, steaks, and so on. And yeah, I wondered, because you're a person, right, and your identity is known, or at least it's relatively easy now for people to identify you. Um, I was curious about that because, like, presumably you have some interaction, or at least are aware of the people. If people are like, "Be careful of the Steakums account; it's a psyop," and then you know who they are and they know who you are. It is this weird thing where, like, well, what you're criticizing Nathan the person
Yes. Yeah.
as well. So I just wonder about that dynamic, like how to manage it or how to react to it.
Oh, I could talk about this for hours. It's an ongoing tension, and I think to what you were pointing to before, like that sort of meta self awareness of the brand. In large part, I think that was probably one of the leading contributing factors to its success because it created this sort of. It worked in two ways. It created an armor against exactly what you just said, where critics can say, "Hey, this is propaganda. This is like a corporation co-opting." The language of our politics or our movement or whatever. It can say any of those things, but the brand's already said them. So it's like, okay, like the brand's admitting this, and not just like one time. Like I made it an effort. If you go through the threads that I've done over the years, like I made it an effort to say in almost every single one of them, and if not every single one of them, just to kind of like remind the consumer or the user of what the interaction just. And I know you guys have touched on this as well, like the sort of inevitable parasociality of
Mm.
like interacting with public figures and brands and just any kind of media where like it's inevitable. Like we just assign senses of credibility and authority to figures that we're consuming with any degree of trust, and it's so important to always caveat, always remind people like you have to like you guys are saying, you can take the information for what it is, and if it's good information, if it stands on its own, then that's great. Like you can take from that what you will, but it is also important to remember the why of where that information is coming from. Like what is the function of it, of the perpetrator of it. Like in this case, it's a brand trying to sell you products. So if you're okay with that dynamic, all good. Like whatever. I mean, if as long as you're aware to it, like that's fine. We all deal with advertising to some extent. But if you're not aware to it, then that can become a pretty serious problem, and it speaks to the sort of depths of our media literacy crisis in terms of just people turning their brains off when they get some kind of fuzzy entertaining rhetoric thrown in their face where they're like, "Oh yeah, this sounds good. I agree with this," or "That's fun. That kind of provoked me in a way. I like that." And then all those like critical thinking senses just turn off, and that was definitely something I was hyper cognizant of throughout the tenure of running the account, and it was difficult for me. I mean, like I don't know, like I come from a pretty left leaning perspective, and I can empathize and sympathize in some ways with a lot of the folks who have kind of leveraged that criticism at me, and I've spent uh, a lot of time directly speaking with them, engaging with them, and just reading, their perspectives. So I don't feel um, I don't agree with all of it, but I do think just like with what you guys are doing, I think there's certain people who would consume your podcast and think like, okay, like I don't agree with the way they characterized, Jordan Peterson like this, but I see the value in the critique here. It's, I think there's something to that where like you don't if there's like a self-awareness to it, it kind of it unloads the burden a bit, to be able to actually like hear what people are saying. And that's personally that's always what's helped me deal with the tension is just kind of like I really do try to take a step back, even when it's like we all know on Twitter, it tends to be really aggressive and spite driven. I tend to try to take a step back, remember where they're coming from, even if there's like sarcasm or hate or whatever kind of laced in it, and try to pick out the truth of the criticism, because I think there's always value in that if you can stomach it.
Yeah, I've read through all of your threads this morning. Actually, I'd seen some of them before, but I read through them all again. And you're quite right. You do emphasize that. Hey, I'm just a corporate account trying to sell you meat. Remember, at the end of everything. And without blowing smoke, I'll just say that they are good. Like the content is good. It's well informed, and it's good advice. So I suppose, like you said, the content matters. So it's obvious for somebody who would be reading those tweets from there. They can see that a lot of it is, I mean, it is authentic. It is well informed. It's good material. You emphasize that, hey, I'm a dude running a corporate meat account, and that's a very healthy thing. I mean, what Chris and I often emphasize is that we're a pair of mediocre academics who are milk toasty, liberal lefty types. So that's gonna, these are our opinions, but just like Brian's saying in Life for Brian, don't follow me, think for yourselves. You do not, and I think that's the big difference when you look at some of the more toxic and pernicious influences out there. They don't tend to do that. Yeah,
Right.
they do the opposite, in fact.
Yeah, and I do think, yeah, it's really tough to, even when you do remind the audience of that consistently, like it's just at a certain point, I don't know if we were planning to get into this at all, but there is just it's unavoidable to kind of create a cult-ish personality around yourself at some degree. I mean, I'd wonder to kind of turn it back around on you guys if you've discussed this in the past, but like as your show has grown, obviously, like anytime something grows, like whether it's a
Mm.
public figure or a group or a media publication or a brand, it kind of takes on a life of its own eventually. And I do wonder, like, just as with the brand, we over time you just develop these kind of cult followers, and there's a certain language, like I don't know, in comedy you call them like bits, or in like journalism you call them beats, like kind of recurring things that you talk about that kind of become part of your personal brand or whatever it is, like whether it's things you discuss on your show that become like that regulars attach themselves to, or just jokes that kind of become like insider jokes. Like these are all things that contribute to the parasociality that comes from consuming any kind of medium or media, and that's definitely something that happened with the Steakum account. And I think the criticism of what you guys have just both laid out, I don't think being self-aware to that necessarily like negates the criticism. I think the criticism can stand valid on their own. The self-awareness from the vantage point of the brand, the self-awareness is just another tool to market the brand. It's kind of this like it's referred to as like anti-marketing in the industry, which is just kind of like when you see ads that intentionally position themselves like they're poking fun at themselves, like we're not like those other brands, we're like one of the cool self-aware brands. And that's it all eventually plays into itself from a brand's perspective. And I think similarly, like from any guru figure, like even up to Trump, where like all press is good press to certain the figures and certain forms of media. So I do wonder, like I don't know if you guys have discussed this at length with your show as you've kind of continued to grow in this sort of culture war space. Have you dealt with that kind of like blending at all, where you guys are kind of becoming the gurus as you decode them yourselves?
Yeah, I think, well, we have discussed, audience dynamics, and also what we encourage or don't encourage. And I think in, like, as your audience grows, the things that you have to consider do change, right? Like it was fine when there's 1,000 people listening to kind of be very nonchalant about your impact, but like if you have 100,000 people listening, then things are different, right? And but aside from that, I I think the point you raise about, if you address a criticism before someone makes it, it kind of it takes the venom out of it, because, like, when someone says you're neoliberal shills, and you're like, yeah, well, we said so, right? And I do think there's an element of that where you can't help but have that be slightly strategic when you do it, right? And I actually think it's a very we covered ContraPoints, and I think this would be a slight difficulty about covering the left wing YouTube breadtube ecosystem, is that there's a lot of ironic, self-referential humor, right? Which kind of it takes the criticism that you might make, and they do it themselves. So, like, if you're doing what we kind of do, and comment on a piece, but they've just said the joke about themselves, it's kind of like it inoculates them. And I recognize that from in academia, when you write a paper, you should have this section which is called limitations, right? And on one hand, limitations exist to tell people what the problems and potential drawbacks with your paper are. But on the other hand, it exists so that other people, you can say, I already thought about that, and I already said it's an issue.
Way
And
ahead of you.
yeah, and I think those two things, they're kind of hard to take out. So that's just like, on that aspect, I think it is good, and there's a genuineness to preempting criticisms that people might have, but there is an element of it where, like you kind of point out, simply acknowledging it doesn't actually mean that you've dealt with the problem or the critique. And yeah, Matt, you might have some different thoughts about the parasociality and that kind of aspect, though.
Yeah, yeah, no, I agree with everything you said there, Chris. But like a different part of Nathan's question was sort of, I guess, yeah, the degree the sort of audience capture and the parasociality and the relationship you have with people who listen to you. And um, eh, I can remember a few times when I've felt that just a tiny bit uncomfortable because it felt a little bit like somebody maybe liked us too much. Like you really, and but that's relatively rare. And I think even in those cases, it's more that I'm kind of sensitive to that. And we really do not want that. Like we wouldn't want to have an Uber fan like some of our gurus have Uber fans, where it doesn't matter really how crazy they get or what they say, those Uber fans are on board no matter what. And I'd like to think that we don't have many, if any, listeners like that. I think even the people that do like us in that sort of, slightly parasocial, but I don't think parasocial is always bad. Obviously, there's a lot of authenticity there as well. And I think even the people that like us personally are pretty comfortable disagreeing with us as well. So I think that's good, and I hope that what we try to channel is the thing that I like best about academic culture, which is that despite all the backbiting and the vanity, it really is one of robust critique and debate. And you can have people that respect and like each other a great deal, and at the same time are going at it hammer and tongs, chipping away and pulling up criticisms and finding flaws, and the other party appreciates that because in responding to those, either rebutting them or maybe elaborating their view in order to accommodate it, they know that it's making their position, their model, whatever, stronger. So um, ideally, we'd like to foster that kind of thing.
And
I
then
don't,
if
yeah.
it,
Oh, go no, go ahead.
I know I don't want to make it you force you to interview us, but the one other thing I just want to add to what Matt said is that the fact that me and Matt are like our primary identity is not podcaster, it's academic, and we do this on the side, right? And I see that with some other podcasts that I like the Very Bad Wizards, right? They're also academics, they teach, and they have a successful podcast. And I think that helps inoculate to some extent from getting culture war brain, where like it's all about the Twitter debates or the whatever the most recent Sam Harris thing is. Like I I would worry more if I was leaving academia and just becoming a podcaster, that would be a dynamic. But when you have this other aspect of your life, which is kind of uh detached from that or separate, it feels like that creates a buffer. Is
Yeah.
one thing I would say.
I think like it's interesting. I guess like I know I don't mean to turn it around on you all during the
It's
interview,
fine.
but it's interesting from my perspective, just because sort of like I was saying earlier, a lot of the space is I don't know who originally said this or if anybody originally said it, but the quote as I hear it often is that in social media culture, brands are trying to be people and people are trying to be brands, and there's like this constant tension where like you're constantly like in this space where like, and I see it within academia, I see it within the medical community, I see it within journalism, where like with social media, people like you might be an expert in like some field, but now you also have this sort of online persona that you manage,
Yeah.
which is like people come to you for your takes on things. And I think with you guys, like there is, I would sign off on everything you both just noted. I would definitely say part of the sort of armor, and I think you share this with the Very Bad Wizards guys to some degree, is the sort of impartiality to how you try to cover a lot of these figures. Like obviously to a listener, there's gonna be biases bleeding through. Like you said, you're both left-ish leaning, liberal leaning, but there's not like a underbed of ideology that you're trying to like prescriptively draw people into. Like that's
Mm.
how I always felt like years ago. I remember like when the Majority Report started covering like Dave Rubin and like
Mm.
being kind of first media organization to really critique him. And I was drawn into that. Like I kind of had a brief period where I was like fascinated by Rubin and like Peterson like in 2015, 16. And I remember getting like hearing those critiques and I was really into it, but like very quickly kind of like realized like, man, this is kind of like unless you were already on the fence, I guess this is kind of like preaching to the choir a bit. Like it's just the idea is prescriptively like we're not just here to deconstruct Dave Rubin or whoever. Like we're here to pull you to our sort of like ideological camp. So I definitely I don't get that vibe from you guys' show, and I think that helps. But I guess from those leftist point of view, they would just be like, oh well, they are like this neoliberal status quo,
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
But it's not as overt. So I think
Yeah.
that's like a helpful
Respect the WHO.
Yeah.
corporate
And,
chivalry.
yeah, but obviously we get it from the right as well. That we do have listeners who are right leaning and listen, and I respect the hell out of them for bearing to listen to us, frankly, because you can tell that it kind of hurts them, and it feels to them as if we're these like woke apologists.
All of
They-
Chris's snide remarks. I mean, yeah, it's just
They think we're candy, like apostles, because we didn't find him, like we didn't tear him apart in the episode that we did. But like that candy episode just constantly comes up, and nobody, I'm not gonna, I don't sign off on Candy's approach to things, but I do feel like most of the people that make comments about Candy, they don't actually, I'm not sure they've listened to anything that he's, they've seen some Twitter threads. And I'm not saying that doesn't mean you can criticize people for, the social media clips or whatever. I'm not doing it, Jordan Peterson, listen to his 20-hour lecture series, because I don't even think they exist. But I mean, what the format of our show is, we take a piece of content and we look at it, and then we look at the stuff that's in that content. And in the content that we looked at with Candy, it wasn't that bad as compared to like lots of the guru figures that we look at. So, but in any case, it doesn't matter. There's a whole bunch of people that are convinced that our goal is to spread the gospel of Saint Candy.
yeah, you won't be able to please everybody in that way. I mean, it's just because it's like the both sidesism journalism conundrum, where like if you try too hard then to like lean in where there isn't a critique, then you just kind of like weight it in a way that it shouldn't be weighted. Like now you're just kind of forcing something that isn't there. I mean, again, not like you said, not that there aren't critiques there, but I think it's more honest from your point of view, to critique it as you see it, not try to make stuff up or push it just for the sake of some arbitrary balance, because you're never going to find that balance no matter no matter who's listening. So,
and Nathan, I have a question that it was kind of spurred by, I read recently this Vanity Fair piece, which is looking at Curtis Yarvin, and the neo-reactionary movement, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I hated that piece. I really hated it because it felt like a piece out of time. It felt like a piece from 2016 when people were talking about the alt-right as like, kind of criticizing it and saying, yes, it's doing all this stuff and it's anti-immigrant and so on. But at the same time, the pieces were like slightly fawning or presenting
Making
them as
them
like,
cool.
yeah, the edge. And that's what this piece does again. But it's doing things like saying, normies like us wouldn't believe that they think institutions need to be torn down and I'm like, what normies are you talking to in 2022 that, after Trump that think, oh, it's strange that people would be critical of mainstream politicians and institutions. And the question I had for you around that was that that piece was very much highlighting that there's a kind of layer of irony protecting people whenever they make these extreme statements, right? They'll say something very extreme about like women not being able to vote or something, but then you're never quite clear, is that irony or is that, them revealing what they do? And the author seemed badly equipped to, to navigate that. And like I said, with the leftist content, which I've seen as well, there's this, I'm not drawing the direct parallel that they're trying to hide more extreme views, but it's a similar thing where there's sometimes ironic references to gulags or this kind of thing, right? Yeah. And it's passed off as kind of, well, that, it's obviously a joke, but there are tankies. And I wonder about, like, from your experience in that in those ecosystems where there's so many layers of irony. Do you have any recommendations about navigating that, or like how do you deal with the fact that the internet is just now just like a machine dripping with irony from every pore, and like taking it seriously is kind of presented as you're missing the point, right? Or you're too po-faced if you think the neo-reactionaries, they're really just, you know, they're neo-Nazis in slightly better clothing or that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's one of the most frustrating talking points or issues that I deal with, especially with a lot of left leaning friends of mine in recent years, because I can remember in 2016, 2017, when the sort of predominant talking point on the left regarding the sort of right wing trolls like Milo Yiannopoulos and Gavin McGinnis, like there was this idea, like, you know, even if they're saying this thing ironically or as a joke, there's still harm, and because it could be a dog whistle, we can't discern the sincerity of it. So it doesn't really matter whether it's sincere or not. We need to take it seriously. But since then, and even before, predating it, but not as much, to much of a degree, I think since then, that same sort of like irony poison has come up, like you said, on the left, not just like with gulag talk, but killing landlords. Like there's all these kind of like very these talking points that people on the left have, that like due to their sort of ideological bend, it becomes a very self-justified comment or critique, and then it becomes this thing where like a lot of these, especially a lot of them are young people, so you got a lot of these people who then are doing it as kind of just part of the group, like I'm going to make this joke because everybody else is making this joke, I want to fit in. But just like with the alt-right in 2016, 2017, you don't know who's sincere about it, and inevitably there will be some, even if it's 0.1% or whatever, there will be some percentage of people who do take it seriously. And I think unfortunately there's not really and so I guess point being, there isn't really a way, like from then to now there is no way to like easily or even like moderately discern, you know, when these people are sincere or not. And I think that's why, to me, it's just always better to err on the side of just not doing it. And when you see it, like, you don't have to, I'm not saying like you have to 100% like assume that the person's acting in bad faith, but I think when people do assume that, that's a safe assumption, because like it's just become the norm in these more extreme ideological camps. I mean, this is literally the white nationalist, or far, however you want to. Some people refer to him as a white nationalist, far right, whatever. But Nick Fuentes,
Yeah.
who essentially, you know, made Holocaust denial comments, and made tons of comments about, you know, the Jewish people, and it's very, he in years past didn't really try as hard to kind of like cover it up. Like he kind of just tried to be as edgy as he could be. And then he essentially got no fly listed, and now he's banned from every platform. So now a lot of his, but he still has a cult following. Like he's still a guru, and he's
Yeah.
only like 24 or something. So he's got this huge following of they call themselves the Groypers online, which is this kind of like new right that's split off of the old far right, like the Richard Spencer types. So now these guys are like, you know, doing the same content, but it's much more masked. And like now it's like, well, how do you know if, like, did these people change? Like maybe are they not as radical now, or are they still just as radical? They're just kind of sounding a little less extreme. And you run into this issue where it's like, there is literally the only way to discern it case by case is by like going through each individual figure's history, like looking up all their logs and videos of them speaking. And it's like, for a layperson, like somebody listening to this podcast, who just kind of like consumes as part of like their daily entertainment or whatever for news, you're never going to be able to accurately discern this person by person. So it's really, it's a frustrating part of the ecosystem of like you know, internet culture. And we were talking a little bit before the show, like there's a long history of like where this sort of like irony style of content, or ironic style of content, has come from. And it's at the point now where everything is so centralized that it's it's showing demonstrable harm. I mean, like just like we saw in all those shootings in like 2018, 2019, you know, the manifestos of how these people are thinking about and writing about the extreme topics they're covering. It's all laden with irony and like in jokes and dog whistles, and you don't know what's what. And there's no, even if somebody wrote a handbook on this, there is no like one-to-one way to figure it out. So I try to just tell people to stay clear, and if you see it, if you're trying to make like a hard line assumption, you just have to go through that person's kind of like catalog and history to figure out if it's the real deal or not, because it's a nightmare to navigate.
I- I'm feeling increasingly guilty listening to you because I'm thinking about my own tweets and stuff and how many of them are tongue in cheek and ironic and even trollish sometimes. Just yesterday I tweeted we could censor maybe 90% of tweets with little loss. Which was kind of intended for people. And but that's exactly what you're talking about. And some of my favorite accounts, like I really like Liam Bright, is a popular philosopher on Twitter, and he is very much in
Super
a
ironic.
yeah, and I actually, so I just really enjoy that, but I'm also agreeing with everything you said. So I mean,
Matt, don't have a
what
crisis on there. Yeah.
what I'm wanting to do is defend. I'm going to try to defend it. I mean, what I would like to think is that, and when people do take me too seriously, I do say I'm joking. I'm just being.
You
this is a
block
joke.
and mute them.
I'm blocking.
You don't know if is that a joke or is that serious? I don't. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's meta all the way down. So
Yeah. So I feel like at least up till now, until hearing you talk, I've squared this circle with myself by telling myself that I've got two voices, and I'm hopefully inserting enough signposts that people know when I have my tongue in my cheek. Chris, you're shaking your head.
Just I
What
know
the-
that's backfired for you when you've attempted to be sarcastic, and then some followers treat you as being serious, and then the option is either to say to them, this was a joke which you missed, or to respond to their heartfelt comment and like ignore that was a joke. So you've caused yourself difficulties. Not that I'm better, but
So,
I'm consistent.
Yeah, you are consistent. I'll grant you that. But I mean, what's the solution here? We either put the crying, laughing emoji in every tweet like that, or do we always tweet in a po-faced, serious, earnest manner?
I mean, it's an impossible balance to strike. I do the same thing. I mean, I still shitpost here and there. I've been trying to lean more into what we just call sincere posting on Twitter more. But I think what you all both know, and I think what most people know intuitively, nobody likes sincere posting. Like people like shitposting. Like it's more entertaining. Like it just, and it also it gives you, again, just like we're talking about the sort of self-referential critiques, it gives you a sort of armor of probable cause. Like you can kind of be like, you have a way out if something gets taken the wrong way. And it's also just like it's literally a spoonful of sugar. I mean, just like comedians, like half of why Joe Rogan is so popular. It's like when you listen to Joe Rogan's podcast, like he's saying like very serious commentary, but he's a quote unquote comedian. So like if he makes some jokes along the way, it's like way easier for the audience to digest. And I mean, Chris, you do this, like you're a pretty like you have a very like a fun sort of sense of sarcasm that I know some people hate. I mean, I think it's like a good. I think you have a pretty decent balance of like not going so far as to like be bad faith and like cutting people down, but also like not being afraid to add a little bit of mockery and like a little bit of fun into like engaging, because that's you have to be successful in literally any field. Like you have to have some level of edge, like a provocation, or else you're just reading an academic paper, and no one wants to read academic papers. So like I don't. There has to be some blend that is the correct blend, but it's a moving target. So I don't know what the
Don't,
solution is
Nathan,
there.
don't neg Matt like that. He's exciting. He's edgy. I think that both Matt and I have the same sense about that. One of our like pet hates, and it's not just because of academia, it's also just because of our personality, is the po-faced seriousness with which so many gurus and online pundits take themselves. And I think there is a genuine value to just piercing the pretentious bubble of people, right? And and you can still take their content seriously and analyze it and take it apart. But just, pointing out the absurdities of Eric Weinstein saying he wears a jacket because he wants to let people know that he's the elite in waiting, right? Or Jordan Peterson showing up to a conversation for a podcast in a, three-piece suit, tuxedo looking
He
thing.
does the bow tie, doesn't he? Sometimes, or
He had a white freaking bow tie last time. It was, like
But you
one.
have to be able to joke about that. Like that, like that's just,
Yeah,
like even if you're the person doing it, like I don't know, like I have a mustache right now. Like if I walked, I don't know, more people will have mustaches these days. I guess it's kind of trendy, but there's certain things you can wear and present yourself as. Like you have to have some kind of self awareness as to like how you're looking and with a particular audience. And I don't know.
yeah. And then, I think there's an important difference between, like, I would say, for example, you talked about the shooters' manifestos and the shit posting content that was in the New Zealand, the Christchurch shooters manifesto. And that to me is a good example of like how confused so many people get in that space, right? Like notably Sam Harris in the conversation I had with him, but many others just were completely flummoxed by the including of shit posting, because they were like, how do we know the ideology, right? There was a copy pasta and he made some jokes about, like, 4chan stuff. So it could be any ideology. And it's like, no, it can't.
Not
It's
in that case. No.
yeah, the great replacement is the title. It's like 80 pages long of like, it's shit posting, but with pure right wing like content. And I think that, that kind of thing we have to treat in a different category than Matt's tweeting behavior. Like he's,
Totally.
it's so the like, and ContraPoint's content as well. I think like she's using irony and she is using it sometimes to deflect criticism, but it's very different than like I think the way that like a Ben Shapiro or a Steven Crowder utilizes that as like a, I think that there is an element. I'm not saying all leftists are the same as ContraPoint in this, but there is a difference between raising a thing which you think is a legitimate critique and kind of, poking fun at it, but also showing that it is an issue, which I think, for example, you did in your threads, and raising an issue and making fun of it so that it can never, that it can't be used against you, but it's just a strategic thing where you're like, it's a bit like the strategic disclaimers. We sometimes get questions about, well, what's the difference between a strategic disclaimer and a genuine disclaimer? And it's like, it's hard to explicitly explain that, but it is often clear in the surrounding behavior that you can see the person didn't mean that they don't have any certainty about this and they're just, discussing possibilities, conspiracy hypothesizing. Whereas when people make genuine disclaimers, it tends to show that they have a genuine like level of uncertainty and an openness to be corrected on things. So yeah, just Matt's sarcasm is not the same as the Christchurch shooter manifesto.
Yeah,
That's my core
no, sorry,
comment.
Matt. I don't mean to.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's safe to say. I mean, like many things are. I think there's a spectrum of ambiguity, and I think like when you have the sort if Matt's sort of shit posting style is at the base of that, and then maybe there's like a couple notches above. You have the Stakem threads where it's like there's again a very sincere message, but it's also juxtaposed with the irony that it's coming from a meat brand and it's kind of self-aware, but it's still propaganda. And then you have like the maybe a couple notches up there, you have ContraPoints, where ContraPoints does use a hell of a lot of shit posting and irony to kind of, like you said, I don't think only deflect criticism, but also again blur some of what her intentions or what her positions are on things, because she doesn't want to get pinned. She's an interesting phenomenon, because like I think most of why she's started to do that more over the years is because she's been quote unquote canceled so many times. It's like she's now trying to like again play that 5D chess of constantly predicting what mobs of people on Twitter are going to say about her
Yeah.
video and then react to that in the video, and it's all very self-referential. But to your point, I still think even though there is a level of ambiguity to that, I don't think many people come away from her videos thinking that they don't know where she sits ideologically.
Mm.
I think you could safely be like, okay, maybe she's somewhere between like a social democrat or a democratic socialist. Maybe she has some anarchist tendencies, but you can safely say she's like far leftish. I mean, like
Yeah.
compared to most of the spectrum. But then above that notch, somewhere above there, you have your Nick Fuentes types who strategically are using that irony and that shit posting to completely obscure their ideology so that they can use it as a
Yeah.
shield then to be like, oh, well, I'm not actually this white nationalist. I'm just making Holocaust denial jokes. So like there's definitely a spectrum going on there, and and you're right, it is really hard to talk about in any kind of one-to-one way, but I think it does all kind of come from this same place of internet culture where everybody just kind of communicates in this way now because it's what's entertaining and it's how we all just kind of couch our views nowadays. So it is tough to navigate, especially for those figures like you mentioned, like a Sam Harris who's kind of on the outside looking in, not really participating on the ground necessarily with the like rolling in the mud like all of us do on like the Twitter culture war stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I like where this conversation has ended up with this spectrum, and you have me and Oscar Wilde at one end, and then you have Peppy the Frog, 4chan people at the other end, and the rest of you are sort of scattered in between.
Somebody needs to
like
design
this.
it. Like, somebody can
Yeah. That's a meme I'm waiting, Matt.
Well, look, this is going to sound like platitudes, but I think it's good to sort of tread lightly and grasp lightly, and I like the humorous, ironic mode for that. And I also kind of believe in the principle, and you keep seeing this on the internet and with this sort of postmodern culture we've got, which is every good thing becomes weaponized, and you get the facsimile of the good thing being used for nefarious purposes. I mean, just to sort of shift the conversation. I mean, thinking about the IDW people and the kind of science and rationality type people. I mean, that's clearly a good thing on the face of it, and you obviously see many people aping that, but really just arguing for something nonsensical, whether it's the Brett Weinstein, Heather Haying sort of naturalism and crunchiness, or some sort of anarcho-libertarian right-wing reactionary politics just sort of smuggled in. So yeah, there's no easy
point.
answers.
Like, it's co-opted across the spectrum, like among like any group. Like, I mean, just like anti-vaxxers today their talking points are much different than they were 10 years ago. Where now they've kind of evolved to talking about, oh no, we're the pro-science. Like, we're like, we really believe in like the process here. We just don't trust those experts that are getting it wrong. And like, there's all these different groups that have kind of figured out, like you said, through this weird postmodern like language devolving that we're going through, where these words and terms and how we use them are just more increasingly difficult to really pin down because everybody has kind of figured out how to weaponize them in whatever way suits their ideology.
Yeah. And I'm curious, Nathan, there are so many different ecosystems online, right? And we spoke a little bit about weird Twitter and the brand Twitter as well. But we're talking about BreadTube and we haven't mentioned yet, but there's each of the platforms kind of has their own ecosystems, right? Like Twitch streaming. I've recently started to follow a little bit of the like Japan blogging people on YouTube, life in Japan, and they're also Twitch streamers, and it's
Yeah.
entering that world is just like it's very interesting because the kind of conventions with the content are different. But I wonder from your like I think familiarity with the kind of people that we cover, plus knowing those worlds, are there anyone or any like ecosystems in general that you think are very ripe for looking at guru-ish figures that maybe have dynamics that are slightly different, from the Jordan Peterson types? But and I'm just curious areas that you think it would be interesting for us to look at that might that we might have overlooked.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I'm sure you've discussed this at some length across the various figures you've covered, but I think the one that always comes back around is essentially gamers and nerds. You know, like gamers as the kind of like cornerstone, that piece that kind of connects all these folks, but then more broadly, people who are gamers who are also like anime fans or people or furries or people who are in some more Tumblr, Reddit esque forum communities that are just kind of really deep online. I think those groups, which have really kind of from like the day one of internet culture, kind of started to disseminate a lot of the shit posting style that we're talking about. They are the sort of, in my view, underbelly of a lot of these gurus and these groups. I mean, I'm sure you're both familiar with Gamergate to some degree, which is always referenced when you talk about the online culture wars. And it's interesting because, like, that was a culmination. I mean, for those listening who don't know, I mean, it was essentially this is 2014, in which there was this scandal where a rumor broke out in the gaming media industry where some journalist had was accused of sleeping with this guy, the game developer, who essentially was trying. There was some bribery going on for a good review of this indie game or something. So this word got out in the gaming community, and it became this whole massive controversy that ended up rising to the levels of mainstream media. All across late night shows and major news publications, and that became a large event that was a predecessor to like the 2016 election cycle and the alt-right and the sort of like incel community or manosphere as it's referred to. So there's all these kind of like interesting subcultures and groups and a lot of the guru type figures that eventually became notorious in years later cut their teeth during this era, like Milo Yiannopoulos and Steve Bannon and Gavin McInnes, and even Shapiro, which he wasn't directly involved in Gamergate, but all like capitalized on a lot of the angst within that community, and like a lot of his YouTube videos, like owning college students, kind of like correlated with a lot of what was going on there. So there's all these like converging factors, and like when you really look at the underbelly of what's driving, like how did this Ben, like when you look at Ben Shapiro's success, like how did Ben Shapiro make it to like mainstream news? Where now like he's a respected public intellectual and he's like interviewing all the top public intellectuals in the world. And you look early on, and it's like a lot of these figures were just propped up by YouTube, like gamers and YouTubers and people doing like React content on these platforms. So to me, those are the figures who are, and like you just said, Chris, like with Twitch, like there's this whole massive underbelly that I think normies, for lack of a better term, they don't necessarily see it, because like by the time they see it, these figures are on their favorite big podcasts and shows, and they're out into the mainstream. But to get there, oftentimes they leverage these gaming communities and these kind of like obscure nerdy online groups, whether it be for like group identity like stuff to kind of like prop up like their own personal brands, or with reactionary content, like they use the kind of like fringe Twitter accounts or college students on campus to then use as kind of like a an attack board to then like really drive engagement, like, oh, crazy feminist gets owned at this thing, and those become your viral headlines that then push you in that way. So those are, to me, I mean, in online culture, it's no secret that those are kind of like the underbelly subcultures that prop up this stuff. But I think a lot of folks who are existing more in the ecosystem of like your Joe Rogans and your Jordan Petersons today, unless they were around 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago when a lot of this stuff was kind of baking, they might just see it on the surface like, oh yeah, these are just like public intellectuals that came out of nowhere, and they got insightful stuff to say. But meanwhile, there's this whole history that goes back a pretty long time, even including like with the new atheist sphere. I mean, this stuff, it has a lot of history in internet culture. So
Yeah.
There's one example that I think, a recent one, which kind of reflects the opposite dynamics of like somebody coming from a little bit. I mean, it's not mainstream, but the Young Turks is an online like media platform. And Hassan
Yep.
Hassan Piker,
Baker,
right?
yep.
Yeah, he was involved there, right? Like I haven't followed his career, but I got the thing that he was like a on-screen personality and had some shows, and then made some controversial comments which about Dan Crenshaw and
Yep.
like how he got the eye patch, and then was kind of uh, chastised by his uncle, right? The Saint Cenk Uygur.
Yep. Shank,
God
yeah.
damn. And
Yeah.
then, but after that, has now become like a huge Twitch streamer, right? With like a kind of leftist bent, but the same thing where we talked about this off air just before, but the thing that gets me about this is like the connection to gamers is very clear because a lot of Twitch streaming is just people playing games and talking while they're or interviewing people even while they're playing games. And like the amount I know that there's like a very long tail where there's a lot of people in those ecosystems who aren't making money, the vast majority of people on them, right? But the people at the top are making so much money.
Oh yeah.
And I think PewDiePie is now somebody on YouTube who, even though he isn't a mainstream figure, he had so many profiles and stuff done on him that people know him. But I think that a lot of these other alternative ecosystem people, they're hugely influential. They've got millions and millions of people in their audience, but they're under under the attention line for mainstream media until they pop through with some controversy. And
I don't want to like drive us too off course here, but I will give you the Hassan lore because I've followed his career from the beginning, and ironically, you're half right in that he had his big kind of mainstream breaks from a lot of his comments, like America deserved 9/11 and the
yeah, yeah.
Dan Crenshaw eye patch thing that did land him like in mainstream media criticism and all that. However, he actually did build his entire current audience, which is predominantly on Twitch, on the backs of the gaming community because Cenk Uygur is his uncle, and he did try to do. He had like an internship with the Young Turks, and then tried to have his own show there, and it just wasn't picking up steam. Like it just wasn't super successful. So he then branched off to do his own thing on Twitch, and he befriended the Twitch streamer Destiny, who kind of founded Twitch Politics, which is now this kind of larger ecosystem of streamers who all just talk about culture wars and political topics. So Destiny actually live on his stream reviewed Hassan debating Charlie Kirk at a Politicon and basically critiqued him the whole way because Hassan Piker did really not a great job in this debate. And then Hassan reached out. I think that was the dynamic. Is Hassan reached out then because he saw that Destiny had the biggest audience in like the political community at the time, to like essentially collaborate. And then those two ended up having this relationship dynamic where they did a bunch of like debate shows on Twitch, and kind of because Hassan had this kind of pre-existing clout from the Young Turks and he was like a model, there was this kind of like interesting dynamic between the two of them, and they eventually had a falling out like a year or two after that. And then that's when around the time those comments were made. So he had this kind of twofold approach where he like hit the mainstream from his provocative comments, but even to this day, I mean, like what he's most known for and like what pays his paychecks is his Twitch audience, which is all gamers and people who watch gamers on that platform. And he still does some political coverage, but I know he's steered largely away from it the past like year or two, other than when there's like a big moment in the news or whatever. But yeah, it's interesting. Like even with him, I mean, like it's gamers all the way down, I guess is what I'm saying.
Well, what you guys are describing is a kind of a pipeline, right? From a medium that's entertainment and totally casual, to certain people getting selected from that reservoir and find themselves like a voice talking about quite serious things, right? With strong ideological or political overtones. And, it's a slightly different example, but you made me think of JP Sears, who got his start producing pure light entertainment, the kind of thing that people would just look at extremely casually for 30 seconds on their phone and then move on YouTube. And now you find him, you know, giving speeches at anti-vax rallies and,
Yeah.
engaging in the most hyperbolic partisan rhetoric in a deadly serious manner and taken very seriously by this broader audience. And, it's kind of a frightening image, isn't it? Because, one of your threads, Nathan, you talked about memes and the history of memes and how it all works. And the there are some things in internet culture that are old and some things that are new. But I think one thing that is new that is a little bit scary is that it kind of functions, these communities function as a kind of reservoir of an incubator for to select for and essentially train certain people to produce the most virulent memes.
Mm.
Yeah, so it's kind of a frightening image.
Yeah. Everything is memes now. I mean, it's like if you can become the meme, or if you can be the meme curator, or the meme, if your community is like kind of like an aggregator of memes. Yeah, I mean, yeah, like from the 2016 election onward. I mean, I think now it's become like a legitimate study academically, where people are actually starting to try to like understand better like the sort of medium of information as it spreads, and it gets weaponized like politically and culturally in so many different ways. And it is like you're saying. I think the scary part of it is the speed in which that has like taken on a cultural force, and the especially older generations. Like I'm 30. I would say really anybody older than me. I mean, like 35 and up. It is increasingly difficult to understand all this stuff. Like I think the sort of
Mm.
image that most folks have of memes at this point, the extent to which is like, oh yeah, I see this thing on my Facebook feed or whatever, or somebody sends me this funny thing. It's got text on an image, and that's really it. But people aren't like they don't have like a critical analysis of like where those images come from, how they get made, how easy is it to make one, like how can you fake things and all that. Like it all happens so quickly, and the sort of rate of our media literacy is just nowhere near where it
Yeah.
needs to be to kind of keep up with where this thing is going, with how powerful they are.
I remember in the 2016 election cycle that like some Trump meme guys like kind of reaching prominence to a certain extent, right? A relatively low level, but they were still being sought out for, comments and interviews because they were producing like shit posty memes for the Donald. And it's not the same thing, but whenever Jordan Peterson had Ta-Nehisi Coates put him into the Captain America comic, right? As the red, basically made the Red
Yep.
Skull say what Jordan Peterson was saying. I thought that's a good example because like Peterson reacted with outrage, right, in a kind of furious, what the hell is this way? But I imagine people in his orbit or it's somebody because he very quickly seemed to pivot to like, oh, let's like adopt the Hydra image into, like something that we can sell, or and the same thing with like putting the lobsters on a tie and stuff.
Yep.
And I feel like there is a constant like battlefield or danger. Like if people produce memes to criticize someone or do something, to kind of mock them, that there's a good chance that that will just get flipped round and become like a thing that they sell. So it is this weird landscape, and I feel increasingly that people talking about, well, that's Twitter and that's not real life and that's that, but like the amount of people in the world that are not online, especially in developed countries, is increasingly very low, right? And they might not be too online in the kind of communities that we're talking about and aware of that. But I think we're in a very different world now where you could ignore what the online ecosystem was doing and promoting. And, most of the things that will end up on Tucker Carlson or that kind of thing, you can find them a couple of months before in these weird subcultures. And
Exactly.
increasingly, rather disturbingly, it's often InfoWars, which
Yeah,
is
they bleed into each other constantly. I mean, like, especially even the flip side of that, which is just the people who, like myself, who kind of grew up with internet culture, are now beginning to become, they're becoming adults and they're actually working at a lot of like whether it's media companies, just companies in general, like your Netflixes, like so these are people who grew up in this worldview and they're engaged in these kind of culture war activities or whatever and meme making, and now they're actually beginning to get influence within corporations and like publications, and it's creating like a whole new dynamic where like that pipeline of information, whether it's memes or ideology or whatever, it's getting a lot shorter. Where it's those lines definitely blur. And ironically, like to what you were just saying earlier about the sort of like co-opting of this stuff, like that's where personally I've gotten the most ire. It's predominantly from left-leaning people, or leftists I should say, for the Steak-umm account, is the idea that through the sort of style of posting that we do, it's like commodifying or just co-opting their language. Like they're like the shit posting to them is like, it's not just like a way of writing. Like it's almost like an identity feature, just like this is how our group speaks to each other. So now when brands start to do that, it's like it poisons it in a way. Or you could say the same to celebrities. Like it's like when a celebrity posts a meme, it's like the meme is dead instantly, or you know what I mean. Like, so, but celebrities, brands, whatever. And that's where I've definitely drawn the most ire from people, is just people who see it's not just like it's not the content that Steak-umm would publish. It's not the self-awareness or whatever. It's actually like you are directly taking from our culture, almost like appropriating it in a way. And I've had, yeah, I mean, it's calmed down now that I'm not running the account. I mean, I got swatted. I had the Secret Service show up at my house at one point because some person posted about they made like a fake account and put my name on it and said I was gonna kill the president, and like the Secret Service took it seriously. I've had a bunch of people like doxing and all sorts of death threats and that type of thing, and it's all come out of that sort of whatever you want to call it, like dirtbag left ecosystem of like of shit posters, where it's just people who are looking at what the brand is doing and they hate it. I mean, they think it's just the worst thing to them, because while all these other kind of like abstract political events might be happening in the world that may have an effect on them, like whether it's healthcare or whatever, I'm sure like obviously there's an impact, but there's only so much they can do. It's not like they don't have like a direct line necessarily, unless, besides voting, to like do something about it. Whereas with this account, it's like it's on Twitter, so they can go after the account. It's very accessible. They can find me by just Googling me. So like it was a very interesting time, and it made me realize how seriously these people take their memes.
You're going to have to stop talking, Nathan, because my mum listens to the podcast and she's already worried about this kind of thing.
It hasn't happened to you yet with all the fan bases you've stoked. I'm sure you're okay.
Yeah, Matt, I don't think, can the Australian government swap people? Do you have that ability?
No, they send around some kangaroos or something. I don't know what they do exactly.
I'm probably relatively safe here as well, because I don't think people can navigate the
Good.
Japanese like infosphere. So yeah, now I've just said that's a bad thing. Don't say
Great.
that to people. Yeah, you always want to make challenges to people online. That's
the thing. Yep.
To anyone oh, sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
We'll cut. But to anyone listening to this who's thinking about doxing me, I can change. I can do better. I mean, sorry. You don't need to send the secret police around.
That was ironic. Whatever he said didn't annoy you. That was irony.
You have to tell them to dox you, because then they won't do it. Then it's ironic, and it won't be.
That's right, Matt. Yeah, the one thing that Matt would just be mundane for him, a walk in the park, as if he was swatted.
Yeah, that'd just make me laugh.
But yeah, it's somewhat insane, to be honest. I didn't know that, David. And like the fact that you were, targeted for swatting, which carries with it the potential in America. This is a unique country in this respect, that like you run the risk when engaging with, special forces, that the wrong signal could be a sign that you need to be gunned down.
Absolutely.
And like,
it's terrifying.
Yeah.
I don't post about. I mean, I shouldn't even have said it on this podcast, but it's all. I don't actively post about it to draw too much attention to it. I've told the story here and there, but it's just it is like you said, one of those things where you don't want to feed, like as it's happening, like that's what the trolls want. Like you're literally feeding the trolls and then you're amplifying that attention and giving them the thing that they want. So they're like, oh, this is a target that we had. Everything that we just did worked. So now we can repeat it until they stop, essentially,
You don't need to worry because the one thing I've discovered with long form podcasting is like people don't like they might, they if someone else goes through and catalogs and clips out, that's fine. But like people don't go and check content. It's one of the weirdest things that Matt and I've noticed is that often people will they'll have very high-minded defenses of Alex Jones content and have no fucking idea what his content is actually like, right? Somebody can bring up what he does, and people are like, "What does he do that?" And you're like, "Well, why are you? Why do you have a very strong position on whether his banning was reasonable or not? If you know none of the specific reasons, but that just seems to be a common thing. So, yeah, I don't think you need to worry about
I'm not
our
worried. Nobody
audience
does the
reaction.
real work to dox these days, and I feel like you have to find like just the most extreme of the extreme people. Because like I mean I'm sure you guys get this all the time. Like I did some tweet a few months ago when Tim Pool had Alex Jones and Joe Rogan on his live show. It was like in like a trailer, and I think I was one of the first people to tweet that was happening while it was happening. So my tweet, and I was kind of mocking it. So my tweet became like the tweet that everybody was quote tweeting and doing their commentary on. And eventually, of course, this made, I think, like Michael Malice quote tweeted it. And then eventually all of those kind of like alt center far right people flooded in. And you start getting all like the insane comments, like people messaging like my Facebook account, all this like weird. You're like, why are you searching me on Google or Facebook and like looking for other ways to message me? So there's always ways to tap into those kind of more extreme groups if you push the right buttons, but generally they don't go that
If
far unless you've done something really bad.
So you're saying even if we follow your advice and we cover Destiny, we're fucked.
Depending on how you cover him, I mean, he's got very. They call themselves the Dalaban. Like it's a very, it's a meme, but like yeah, they're a very loyal online community to say the least.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I could literally just probe your mind for the rest of the day about like the minutia of various online communities, but we probably should let you return to your actual life or online life. But I'm kind of curious, Nathan. Like, so you're not doing the Steakums account anymore. Are you planning? Are you still in? I don't know what that's called, like brand management,
Brand
or
Yeah.
and
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
relatedly, I guess if you went to another brand and like started posting, you know, threads about conspiracy explainers and stuff, it wouldn't have the same impact. But you seem to be someone who genuinely has an interest in that area. So a kind of second part of that question is just, are you planning to, continue doing stuff in the field of misinformation or online stuff, or is that just a personal interest?
Yeah, that is a good question because I've been wrestling with this for a couple of years now. Honestly, I mean, I've worked in marketing for almost a decade at this point. It's just day job, pays the bills, and now the Steakum thing obviously has kind of elevated a lot of my public image, I guess, and more people know about my work. But obviously, I like you just alluded to, most of what interests me is this kind of internet culture and culture war space, and I've done a lot of just personal writing about it. Which I should also note, if anybody has made it this far into the show, if you Google brand Twitter, an article, it's either the first or the second thing that will come up on Google is an article in Vulture magazine. I wrote in 2019. That's like a history of kind of all this stuff from brand Twitter. It's decent. I mean, it took me and the editors a long time to compile. Just to kind of, for anybody who wants to deep dive the weirdness of brands.
We'll put it in the show notes as well,
Yeah, okay,
as people
perfect.
say.
Perfect. But yeah, so I don't like I am really interested in misinfo and media literacy and this space, and I've been writing a lot of articles about it and like considering different angles for a book at some point. It is tough on top of the day job. So I'm just trying to figure out, which direction to take because definitely much more interested in this. And obviously, I was able to leverage my interest in these things through that brand account. So it will be, we'll see, I guess, how those things maybe collide in the coming years. But as of now, I'm just kind of doing the commentary and the writing on the side as more hobbyism. So we'll see.
Well, yeah. Well, from both of us, I'll just say that I think the kind of stuff that you did through that stake-home account was really fantastic. And yeah, for listeners, if you want to pop on Twitter and just read that sort of meta thread of threads, there's good material in there, and we'll link to some of your other materials. And yeah, so from Decoding the Gurus, we hope you do find the time to keep doing
Yeah.
more of this stuff because we like it. It gets the seal of approval from us.
That's huge. That's everything to me.
Yeah.
Love you guys' show. I mean, yeah, you're doing great work, and it's vital deconstruction that is not. It's unfortunately not common enough. I think in these online spaces, especially within the figures that you approach. So I'm a big fan, and really appreciate you having me on for this.
Careful, Nathan. Sincerity and prayers. It's
Sincere poster. This is like I'm trying to escape the irony-brained shit posting, but
it's I will say that we often have this trouble that like at the end of interviews, that we want to sincerely say that we like the person's content and we like them, but we've often previously just explained or complained about people being overly fawning and
super
stuff. And
corny and yeah.
yeah, and I always like, I feel it kind of burning in my soul when people say sincere nice things. But in any case, we did and do really like the stuff that you put out, and also it was really great to talk to you about this stuff. I've been trying to arrange it through my terrible arranging skills for like half a year. So thanks for coming on, and I'm sure it would be great to have you back at some time whenever there's more mentalness in the like online sphere, which is always. So yeah.
Absolutely. Well, it's been a pleasure. Again, I appreciate it, and yeah, I can't wait to chat again.
Thanks so much, Nathan. See you next time.
Ciao.